So this PowerPoint is going to be about the classification of skills. First, we need to understand what a motor skill is. So basically, a task that involves a sequence of movements that are reasonably complex to the individual performing them. And the individual must undertake a period of learning. So when we are performing a motor skill, we often learn them. So skill classification is based on the environment in which the skill is performed in, the amount of physical effort required to perform the skill successfully, so the amount of muscle groups that may be involved, and also the type of movement required to execute the skill. So when we're looking at the motor skills, I often use this continuum. So skill classification can either be discrete, continuous, or serial. They can either be fine or gross, and skills can either be classified as open or closed. So let's look at them in a bit more detail. So discrete skills, these skills have a distinct beginning and an end. So for example, you'll start the skill, perform it, and then finish it. So an example of that is a discus throw or a penalty flick in hockey. Okay, there's a clear beginning and an end. Perhaps a tennis serve is a discrete skill. Maybe a basketball free throw. A continuous skill is going to be a skill that has no clear beginning and end. So something like riding a bike, running, dribbling a soccer ball, dribbling a basketball, swimming, juggling, all of those skills are going to have no clear beginning and an end. And then finally, serial. So this is where there's a series of discrete skills joined together to perform a continuous performance. So for example, a tennis rally is a really good one. So it's got the discrete skill of a tennis serve, forehands and backhands, but when all combined, it performs a series of serial skills. Another example is also a gymnastics routine. So whilst in the gymnastics floor routine there might be a handstand, a forward roll, a pirouette, those are all performed alone, they're discrete skills, but when we can perform them together in a routine, it's a serial skill. So skills can also be fine and gross. So fine skills are skills which involve the small muscle groups. So muscle groups, think about your fingers, perhaps in your toes. So some examples of that are throwing a dart. So darts, that is a very fine motor skill. Playing a musical instrument is a fine motor skill, and drawing. In comparison to fine motor skills, we have got gross motor skills, and these are motor skills which involve larger muscle groups. So for example, kicking a football is going to use the major muscle groups of the legs and the glutes. Swimming, the whole body, all of the muscle groups are involved, and also doing a cartwheel. They're all examples of gross motor skills. So when we, some skills do incorporate elements of both fine and gross motor skills. An example of this is spin bowling, which requires the use of large muscle groups in the arms and legs. Okay, so you're going to use the legs for a few steps coming in, large muscle groups in the shoulder, the back and the arms to get your wheel action, and then smaller muscle groups in the wrist and fingers to actually release the ball and apply that spin. When we've got skills like that, we can put them somewhere on this continuum. So right up this end of the continuum are very completely fine motor skills. So for example, the act of throwing a dart, okay? And right up the opposite end here, we've got completely gross motor skills. So this would be like your swimming and your running. So the act of spin bowling can go somewhere along this continuum. So it has, like we said, it has some fine elements in the wrist and fingers, but it does require those gross elements of the arms. So it might be, marked about here on our continuum. So more up the gross end, but it still has some fine elements. So when we think about things like darts, that would be right up this end, and swimming would be right up this end. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. Also, perhaps the act of handstand on a balance beam in gymnastics, whilst it's going to use lots of gross muscles, it's going to have some fine motor control in the hands and the feet to grip the balance beam. So that once again might be sort of towards here. Okay, so it doesn't matter where you really put the tick specifically, but as long as it's in general around the right place and you can justify why you've put it there. Skills can also be classified as open and closed. So if we're looking at an open skill, we're looking at the environment. Is the environment predictable or unpredictable? And if it's open, it's going to be an unpredictable environment. Open skills are externally paced. This means that the performer decisions on when to execute the skill is determined by external factors. So for example, they don't have any control when they start and stop the skill. So for example, surfing is a really good example. They don't decide when they can catch the wave. They're relying on the sets rolling through. And also receiving in tennis is an example of an open skill because you are relying and it's externally paced because you're waiting for the person to serve to you. Closed skills is where the opposite. So the environment is very predictable and the conditions stay the same. So these aren't usually chaotic and changing and diverse environments. Also, they're internally paced. So that means that the performer decides when they start and stop the skill. And the same technique can be used repeatedly. So for example, javelin, high jump, long jump, they're all really good examples of closed skills where the environment stays the same and the performer just repeats their technique and they decide when they begin and perform the skill. Archery is another example. So the target is stationary and the performer decides when they begin and perform and execute. So open and closed skills. So let's just look at this. So closed skills these are the internally paced ones. The performer controls the pacing. The environment's very stable and fixed, and we can just stereotype movement patterns. So we can just rehearse those techniques. So closed skills on our continuum are things like performing a handstand, archery, and even cycling. Okay, cycling getting a bit more open because perhaps the environment or the track might be a little bit unpredictable. Open skills is where it's predominantly perceptual and the environment controls the pacing of the skill. So the changing and dynamic environment controls the pacing, and therefore the movement patterns must be adapted to that. So things like whitewater rafting, perhaps sailing, surfing, they're going to be completely open because the environment's depending upon that skill. Any of our field games or invasion games, basketball, football, soccer, netball, the situation's constantly dynamic and changing, and there's lots of players on the field and they're moving around, and so you're constantly having to adjust and move according to where the ball is, where your opponents are, where your teammates are. So they're really good examples of open skills. So here's a continuum once again. I'll just get in. So place the following activities on the continuum below. So we've got a penalty shot in basketball, shot put, tennis rally, football, kick on the run. So you can think about where those would go. So a penalty shot in basketball, is that open or closed? It tends to be more closed because it's internally paced and the target's very stationary. There's no real pressure. Shot put would also be a great example of a closed skill. Tennis rally, on the other hand, is going to be a bit more towards the open end of the continuum. And a football kick on the run. So the goals are going to be stationary, but there might be opponents chasing them, which are going to mean that it's not so internally paced. So that one could be a good one around the middle. So here's some examples of open and closed skills. So we've got a weightlifter, golf, a cricketer, a batsman particularly hitting, football, obviously having a shot at goal, and surfing. So you can think about whether some of these are open or closed. The weightlifter would be definitely closed. The golfer is definitely more closed. Receiving the ball in cricket would be open. This sort of situation in football would also be open. There's a pressure here implied by the defender, so the external environment is placing demands on the person with the ball. And also surfing is an example of an open skill.